Okay, so I promised myself never to make a Riley Dennis response video, but then yesterday she just had to come up with this video talking about a bunch of things that's been on my mind and I just couldn't resist, so let's just get into it.
Last week, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, white nationalists, and KKK members held a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia.
So throughout this video, Riley will be referring to the protesters as Nazis. Now, we can argue all day long about how many people at the rally actually believed whites are the superior race and need to commit mass genocide to achieve a white ethno-state. Alt-right, neo-Nazi, white nationalist, white supremacist, white identitarian, let's just cut our losses and say it was a loose collective of groups united by a common sentiment of pro-white identity and the preservation of white identity as integral to American history, American culture, and American national identity. With that in mind, let's continue.
Immediately afterwards, Trump failed to condemn the Nazis by name. Instead, he blamed the violence on many sides.
Well, that's because there was violence on many sides, but Riley knows this. We'll get to her reasoning on this later.
And I've seen a lot of people echoing that sentiment. When you talk about the murder of Heather Heyer, someone pops up and says, what about the violence that Black Lives Matter and anti-fascists have caused? But the problem with that is that it's drawing a false equivalence.
I would agree that would be a false equivalency. But if you're going to label every protester at that rally a Nazi, then of course any comparison between Black Lives Matter and the protesters at that rally would be a false equivalency. But if you compare BLM with the protesters who were there to speak out against the anti-white bias and racist sentiments at every level of American government, academia, and media, then that would actually be a true equivalency.
Violence is inherent to Nazi ideology.
Speaking of inherently violent ideologies, did you guys know that Riley's a communist?
Just to be clear though, I am a communist. That's true.
Let me break it down by drawing an accurate equivalency between the ideology of Nazism and the ideology of communism, one that Riley seemed to have conveniently avoided throughout the video. Nazism is no more inherently violent than communism. In theory, white nationalists can congregate in some uninhabited territory and peacefully establish a white state, and communists can do the same and go form a commune in the woods. So hypothetically, there are circumstances in which no violence would be involved in these ideologies, because neither of them have violence as an end goal. The problem is that both these ideologies inevitably revert to violence as a means to achieving their goals when it comes to real-world implementation. At the end of the day, the far right is no more inherently violent or murderous than the far left. They're both collectivist authoritarian ideologies that undermine the values that are foundational to Western liberal democracies.
And in regards to anti-fascists, they're harder to pin down because they're not an organization with leaders like Black Lives Matter.
Actually, they're pretty easy to pin down. Antifa was initially part of the Soviet Union's front operations to bring about communist dictatorship in Germany in the 1920s, and it worked to label all rival forms of government as fascists. And not much has changed since. Antifa label any activity, group, or individual right of center fascist, and then proceed to target them violently. They have their roots in one of history's most murderous communist dictatorships. They parade around the communist flag at every opportunity, and they proudly don the hammer and sickle across their face. Antifa is decidedly communist.
Violence against fascists is not the same as violence used by fascists. Anti-fascism is not fascism. The thing is, we can all agree that not all violence is equal. That's why we have laws that allow for self-defense. Sometimes violence is not justified, sometimes it is. So in terms of large-scale societal violence, fighting fascism is self-defense.
And we finally reached the crux of this whole debate. You know, I've played a centrist with who was more violent, the protesters or the counter-protesters, but fuck it, I'm just gonna come out and say it. It is so unlikely to me that there was equal rates of instigation of violence on many sides if you were to go by Antifa and their far left counterparts' history of instigating violence. Right-wingers and even Nazis are never the ones intimidating and attacking reporters and innocent bystanders. They're not sending death threats to people, and they're not trying to shut down events they don't agree with. That behavior almost exclusively comes from the far left. And Riley Dennis perfectly demonstrated why. Because they see it as self-defense. The radical left literally sees the holding of beliefs they deem to be fascist to be the first blow, because fascist ideas lead to violence, and leftists are the ones defending themselves against this violence. But I can say the exact same thing about you, Riley. You're a fucking communist, Riley. The ideology that you hold has killed 94 million people over the 20th century. Nazism was a fucking sliver of that. Your ideology has proven time and time again that it strips people of their fundamental human rights before it kills them. Your ideas lead to violence, Riley. Does that mean you have cast the first fist? Does that mean I get to beat the shit out of you if we ever cross paths? By your reasoning, it does. How do you have so little self-awareness? Nazism, the alt-right, white identitarianism, communism, Black Lives Matter, they all basically have the four same things in common. They're authoritarian, they're collectivist, they cultivate a victim complex in the in-group by telling them they're oppressed by the out-group, which they demonize and vilify. In the case of white nationalism, whites are the victims of non-whites who are taking over their country. In the case of communism, the proletarians are victims of the bourgeoisie who exploit their labor. In the case of Black Lives Matter, black people are the victims of racist whiteys. You're all the fucking same. As Freud put it, it's just narcissism over minor differences. It is precisely communities with adjoining territories and close relationships that engage in constant feuds and mutual ridicule because of hypersensitivity to details of differentiation. It's exactly because the far left and the far right are so similar ideologically that they fight so viciously, and on some level they fucking know it. And you know what, maybe I'll start giving as much of a shit about Charlottesville as Riley would like me to, once 11% of America would stop thinking that communism would better serve the needs of the country than the current system. Maybe I'll give a shit about assholes waving swastikas and chanting blood and soil, once it's taboo to wear your Che Guevara t-shirt or to be an openly communist professor. Maybe I'll start giving a shit once the media stops covering up for a violent communist organization that seeks peace through violence. Maybe I'll start giving a shit about the rise in violent Nazism once we snap out of our collective delusion and recognize the decades-long normalization of murderous far-left dogma. Maybe I'll start giving a shit once you stop calling yourself a fucking communist, Riley.